The morning sun cast a golden glow across the manicured gardens of Kensington Palace as Catherine, the Princess of Wales, stood by the tall windows of her private study. Her fingers trembled slightly as she held the official letter that would change everything. The royal seal at the bottom seemed to mock her as tears began to well in her eyes. This wasn't supposed to happen. Not now. Not when their children were still so young and needed stability in their lives. William entered the room quietly, his footsteps barely audible on the Persian carpet. He had seen that expression on his wife's face only once before, on the day they received news about his grandmother's declining health. Without saying a word, he crossed the room and wrapped his arms around her from behind, resting his chin on her shoulder. Catherine leaned back into his embrace, finding comfort in his familiar warmth and the subtle scent of his cologne. The letter contained news that would send shockwaves through the Commonwealth realms. Due to unexpected political changes and constitutional requirements, William and Catherine would need to relocate to Australia for an extended period of at least 3 years. The role was crucial for maintaining diplomatic relations, but it meant leaving behind everything they had built in England. Their children would need to adapt to a completely new country, new schools, and new friends. George, their eldest, had finally settled well at his current school after some initial struggles with the pressure of being a future king. Charlotte was thriving in her ballet classes and had formed close friendships with children from families they trusted. Louis, still so young and innocent, barely understood the weight of royal duties but loved his routine of morning walks in Hyde Park with his security detail who had become like family to him. Catherine turned in William's arms, her blue eyes reflecting a mixture of duty and heartbreak. She knew this assignment wasn't optional. The monarchy required sacrifices, and they had both understood this from the moment they exchanged vows in Westminster Abbey over a decade ago. Yet understanding something intellectually and living through it emotionally were two entirely different experiences. The couple had faced many challenges together. They had weathered media storms, public scrutiny, and the intense pressure of royal life. They had supported each other through family losses, health scares, and the constant balancing act between public duty and private happiness. But this felt different. This wasn't just about them anymore. This was about uprooting their children from the only home they had ever known. William cupped his wife's face gently in his hands, his thumb brushing away a tear that had escaped despite her efforts to remain composed. He had learned to read every expression on her face over the years, and right now he could see the internal battle she was fighting. Catherine had always been the stronger one emotionally, the one who kept their family grounded and provided stability for their children. Seeing her struggle made his own heart ache in ways he hadn't expected. They sat together on the small sofa near the window, the letter forgotten on the nearby table. Outside, they could hear the distant sounds of London traffic and the occasional laugh from tourists gathering at the palace gates. These sounds had become the soundtrack of their daily lives, as familiar as breathing. Soon these would be replaced by the sounds of Sydney Harbor, different accents and unfamiliar rhythms of a life on the other side of the world. Catherine spoke first, her voice barely above a whisper. She talked about the children's upcoming school events, Charlotte's dance recital, George's cricket matches, and Louis's excitement about starting proper lessons. Each mention of their normal life felt like another small goodbye. William listened without interrupting, knowing she needed to voice these concerns to process the magnitude of what lay ahead. The afternoon sun began to shift, casting longer shadows across the room as they discussed practical matters. They would need to inform the children gently, prepare them for the transition, and somehow make this sound like an adventure rather than an exile. The royal household would need to coordinate with Australian officials, security would need to be completely reorganized, and they would need to maintain their British royal duties while establishing new ones in Australia. As evening approached, Catherine finally stood and smoothed her dress, transforming back into the composed princess the public knew. But William caught her hand as she passed, squeezing it gently. In that simple gesture, they communicated everything they couldn't say aloud. They were in this together, as they had always been, and they would find a way to make it work for their family while serving the crown with dignity and grace. The children's playroom fell silent as William and Catherine sat across from their three little ones, the weight of the conversation ahead pressing heavily on their hearts. George, now old enough to understand more complex situations, sensed the serious tone immediately and put down his model airplane. Charlotte stopped brushing her doll's hair and looked between her parents with curious eyes. Louis continued playing with his blocks, oblivious to the tension in the room. Catherine had rehearsed this moment dozens of times in her mind, but now that it was here, the words felt inadequate. How do you explain to children that their entire world is about to change because of duty and service? How do you make them understand that sometimes adults have to make difficult choices that affect the whole family? She reached for William's hand, drawing strength from his steady presence. William began speaking in the gentle, patient tone he reserved for bedtime stories and scraped knees. He explained that they were going on a very long adventure to Australia, a beautiful country with different animals, beaches, and exciting places to explore. He made it sound magical, describing kangaroos hopping through parks and colorful birds that would visit their new garden. George listened intently, his young mind already working through the implications. The questions came quickly after that. Charlotte wanted to know if she could bring her favorite teddy bear and whether there would be other children to play with. Louis asked if they were going on an airplane, his eyes lighting up with excitement at the thought. But George's question cut straight to the heart of the matter. He asked how long they would be away and if they were ever coming back home. Catherine felt her composure wavering as she watched her eldest son process this information with a maturity that seemed far beyond his years. She knelt down to his level and explained that sometimes grown-ups have important jobs that take them to different places, but that didn't mean they loved their home any less. She promised that they would always consider England their true home, no matter where their duties took them. The family spent the rest of the evening looking at pictures of Australia on Catherine's tablet, exploring virtual tours of Sydney, and learning about the unique wildlife they might encounter. William told them stories about his own travels there and how friendly the people were. Gradually, the children's initial uncertainty began to transform into curiosity and excitement about the adventure ahead. Over the following weeks, the reality of their departure became more tangible as preparations intensified. The children were gradually withdrawn from their current activities in schools. Catherine spent emotional afternoons with Charlotte's dance teacher, explaining the situation and arranging for recommendations in Sydney. George's cricket coach wished him well and gave him a special bat to remember his English team. The hardest part was watching the children say goodbye to their friends. Catherine accompanied Charlotte to a farewell play date, where the little girls promised to write letters and video call every week. George handled his goodbyes with typical British stoicism, but Catherine noticed him wiping his eyes when he thought no one was looking. Even Louis seemed to sense something significant was happening, as he clung more tightly to his favorite security guard during their final walk through Hyde Park. The royal staff worked tirelessly to coordinate the massive logistics of relocating a royal household across the globe. Dozens of official meetings were held to arrange security protocols, establish communication systems, and coordinate with Australian officials. Catherine found herself caught between the excitement of a new adventure and the heartbreak of leaving behind a lifetime of memories and relationships. William threw himself into research about their new role and responsibilities, studying Australian culture, politics, and social issues. He wanted to arrive as more than just a figurehead. He wanted to make a meaningful contribution to the relationship between Britain and Australia. Catherine began reaching out to Australian charities and organizations, hoping to continue her advocacy work in mental health and early childhood development. The couple also had to consider more personal matters. They arranged for regular video calls with Catherine's parents, knowing how difficult the separation would be for grandparents, who had become such integral parts of their grandchildren's daily lives. They made plans for extended visits during school holidays and special occasions, though they knew it wouldn't be the same as having family nearby for impromptu Sunday dinners and bedtime stories. As their departure date grew closer, both William and Catherine found themselves becoming more emotional about seemingly simple things. Catherine teared up while packing Charlotte's favorite books, realizing these bedtime stories would soon be read in a different hemisphere. William spent extra time in his study, running his fingers along the spines of books that had belonged to his father and grandfather, knowing these family treasures would remain in England while he started this new chapter in Australia. The children, meanwhile, had begun to embrace the adventure with the resilience that only young people possess. George started learning about Australian geography and proudly shared facts about the country with anyone who would listen. Charlotte practiced her ballet positions and announced that she would teach Australian children how to curtsy properly. Louis, in his innocent way, simply asked when they could see the kangaroos, his excitement infectious and pure. The grand ballroom of Buckingham Palace had been transformed into an intimate farewell gathering, with warm lighting casting a golden glow over the assembled guests. This wasn't the formal state dinner Catherine had initially dreaded, but rather a heartfelt celebration of family, friendship, and service. She moved through the room with practiced grace, but those who knew her well could see the emotion she was working to contain behind her composed smile. King Charles approached his son and daughter-in-law with visible pride mixed with paternal concern. The conversation between father and son carried the weight of generations of royal duty, but also the tenderness of a father worried about his grandchildren's well-being. Charles placed a gentle hand on William's shoulder and spoke quietly about the importance of this mission, not just for the monarchy, but for strengthening the bonds between nations that had been family for centuries. Catherine found herself surrounded by friends who had become sisters over the years. These were the women who had supported her through the challenges of royal life, who had celebrated her triumphs and held her through her struggles. They shared memories of school events they had attended together, charity galas where they had worked side by side, and quiet moments of laughter over tea when the pressures of public life had felt overwhelming. The children moved through the gathering with the confidence that came from being surrounded by people who genuinely loved them. George engaged in serious conversations with his grandfather about Australia's history and government structure. Charlotte charmed everyone with her questions about Australian ballet and whether the tutus there were different colors. Louis, still young enough to be completely unaware of the significance of the evening, delighted guests with his innocent observations and endless energy. William found himself in deep conversation with his brother Harry, who had joined the gathering. Via video call from his home in California, the brothers shared an understanding of what it meant to serve the crown while protecting one's family, and Harry offered practical advice about adjusting to life in a new country. Their conversation carried undertones of their own complex relationship, but tonight was about support and family unity above all else. As the evening progressed, Catherine stepped away from the main gathering and found herself in the palace's portrait gallery, surrounded by paintings of royal family members from centuries past. She studied the faces of queens and princesses who had made similar sacrifices for duty, wondering if they had felt the same mixture of honor and heartbreak that she was experiencing. Each portrait seemed to whisper stories of choices made for the greater good, of personal desires set aside for service to country and commonwealth. William found her there, understanding instinctively where she would go when she needed a moment to collect herself. They stood together in comfortable silence looking at a portrait of his grandmother, Queen Elizabeth II, painted during her younger years as a mother with small children. The parallel wasn't lost on either of them. Here was a woman who had navigated the complexities of royal duty while raising a family, who had made countless sacrifices with dignity and grace. The couple returned to their guests, where the evening took on a more relaxed atmosphere. Stories were shared about memorable moments from William and Catherine's royal duties, from their first joint overseas tour to recent charitable initiatives that had made real differences in people's lives. These weren't just professional accomplishments being celebrated, but genuine impact on communities and causes they cared deeply about. Catherine's mother, Carol Middleton, presented her daughter with a beautifully crafted photo album containing pictures from every stage of her life with William and the children. The album included handwritten notes from family members, friends, and even some of the palace staff who had watched the children grow up. It was designed to be a tangible connection to home during the years ahead, a reminder of the love and support that would always be waiting for them in England. The evening's most touching moment came when the household staff presented the family with their own farewell gift, a hand-painted map of Australia with special markers indicating places they hoped the family would visit and explore. Each staff member had researched different regions and attractions, turning their sadness about the departure into excitement about the adventures ahead. The gesture embodied the unique relationship between the royal family and those who served them. Professional, but genuinely caring. As guests began to depart, the hugs lasted longer than usual, and the promises to stay in touch carried extra weight. Catherine found herself memorizing faces and voices, knowing that video calls and written correspondence, while precious, couldn't fully replace the warmth of being surrounded by people who truly understood her life and challenges. These friendships had been her anchor through the most difficult periods of royal life. The children eventually fell asleep in various chairs around the room, exhausted from the excitement and attention. William and Catherine took turns carrying them to their bedrooms, each parent taking extra time tucking them in and whispering quiet reassurances about the adventure ahead. In the peaceful silence of the children's wing, the reality of their impending departure felt both surreal and inevitable. Back in their own bedroom, William and Catherine sat on their bed surrounded by suitcases and packing lists, the detritus of a life being carefully organized for transport across the world. They held hands in the lamplight, each lost in their own thoughts about the magnitude of what they were undertaking. This wasn't just a career change or a temporary assignment. This was a complete reimagining of their family's daily existence in service to something larger than themselves. The morning of departure arrived with typically unpredictable British weather, a mixture of sunshine and threatening clouds that seemed to mirror the emotional complexity of the day ahead. Catherine stood in their bedroom at Kensington Palace, for the last time, taking in details she had never noticed before. The way the morning light hit the family photographs on her dressing table, the sound of London traffic filtering through the windows, the familiar creak of the floorboards that had become the soundtrack to countless early mornings with crying babies and bedtime stories. The children approached the day with the excitement typical of young people embarking on an adventure. George had packed his cricket bat and a collection of British coins to show his new Australian friends. Charlotte insisted on wearing her favorite dress with the Union Jack pattern, declaring it would help her remember home. Louis clutched his stuffed corgi, a gift from his great-grandmother, and asked repeatedly when they would see the kangaroos. Schiester, drive through London toward the airport became an impromptu farewell tour. The family sat together in their official car, pointing out landmarks and sharing memories associated with different locations. They passed the hospital where all three children had been born, the park where they had taken countless family walks, and the shops where Catherine had spent quiet moments trying to maintain some semblance of normal family life, despite the constant presence of security and media attention. At Westminster Abbey, William asked their driver to slow down so they could see the place where they had been married on that magical day in April 2011. Catherine reached for his hand as they looked at the ancient building where they had promised to love, honor, and support each other through whatever challenges life might bring. Neither of them had imagined that whatever challenges would include relocating their entire family to the other side of the world, but their commitment to each other and to their duty remained unshaken. The airport departure was carefully orchestrated to balance the family's need for privacy with the public's interest in this significant royal transition. A small group of media representatives had been invited to document the departure, while security ensured the family could have genuine moments together without feeling like they were performing for cameras. Catherine wore an elegant blue coat that had become one of her signature colors, while William chose a formal suit that conveyed both respect for the occasion and confidence about the journey ahead. King Charles arrived to see them off, bringing with him a tangible sense of family, continuity, and support. His embrace with each grandchild lasted longer than usual, and his conversation with William carried the gravity of a father sending his son on an important mission while simultaneously worried about his family's well-being. The king presented Catherine with a small wrapped gift, asking her not to open it until they were settled in Australia. The gesture was typical of his thoughtful nature and provided something to look forward to during the difficult transition ahead. The airplane, itself was a marvel of diplomatic necessity and family comfort. The royal section had been configured to accommodate both official requirements and the practical needs of traveling with 3 young children. Catherine had worked with the staff to ensure familiar items from home were incorporated into the space. Favorite blankets, beloved books, and small treasures that would provide comfort during the long journey. As the engines began their final preparations, Catherine found herself overcome with unexpected emotion. This wasn't just leaving for a vacation or official tour. This was closing one chapter of their lives and opening another in a completely different country. She thought about all the small daily routines they were leaving behind. Morning tea, with friends, impromptu visits with her parents, the children's established activities and friendships that had taken years to develop. William noticed his wife's emotional state and gently guided her to their private seating area, away from the children and staff. In the quiet space, Catherine finally allowed herself to cry, not the composed tears of public moments, but the raw emotion of a mother and wife facing enormous change. William held her closely, understanding that sometimes strength meant acknowledging vulnerability and allowing yourself to grieve what you're leaving behind. The children, meanwhile, had settled into their seats with the adaptability of youth. George studied maps of Australia and practiced pronouncing the names of cities they would visit. Charlotte arranged her dolls and stuffed animals, explaining to them that they were going on a big adventure and shouldn't be scared. Louis looked out the window with wide eyes, pointing excitedly at every airplane and vehicle he could see on the tarmac. As the airplane prepared for takeoff, Catherine composed herself and returned to sit with her family. She helped Louis with his seatbelt and reminded Charlotte to hold her favorite stuffed animal during takeoff. The family joined hands as the plane began to move, creating a small circle of connection and solidarity as they literally and figuratively launched into their new life. The takeoff was smooth, and soon London began to disappear beneath the clouds. Catherine pressed her face to the window, trying to catch a final glimpse of the city that had been their home, the place where their children had been born and where they had built their life together as a family. Below them, the familiar patchwork of British countryside gave way to the English Channel, and then to the vast expanse of sky that would carry them toward their new destiny in Australia. William squeezed his wife's hand as they settled into the long flight ahead. They both understood that when they landed in Sydney, they would be different people facing different challenges in a different hemisphere. But they would face these changes together, as they always had, with love for each other and commitment to the service that had brought them to this moment of both ending and beginning. The landing in Sydney brought a rush of new sensations that momentarily overwhelmed the family's senses. The air felt different, warmer, with unfamiliar scents carried on breezes that spoke of eucalyptus trees and ocean salt. Catherine stepped off the airplane, holding Louis's hand while trying to manage the emotional complexity of arriving somewhere that felt both exciting and completely foreign. The Australian officials who greeted them were genuinely warm and welcoming, but their accents and mannerisms highlighted just how far from home they really were. The children reacted to Australia with the wonder that only young people can muster in the face of completely new experiences. George immediately noticed how different the light looked, commenting that everything seemed brighter and more vivid than back home. Charlotte was fascinated by the birds she could hear singing in languages she didn't recognize, their calls nothing like the familiar sounds of English gardens. Louis simply stared at everything with wide eyes, occasionally tugging on his mother's hand to point at something that captured his attention. Their new residence was a beautiful colonial-style mansion that had been carefully prepared to balance official requirements with family comfort. Australian staff had worked with British counterparts to ensure familiar items from Kensington Palace were integrated into the new space, but the overall feeling was undeniably different. Catherine walked through rooms filled with unfamiliar furniture and strange shadows, trying to envision how her children would adapt to calling this place home. The first few days were a whirlwind of official meetings, courtesy calls, and necessary adjustments that left little time for processing the emotional reality of their relocation. William threw himself into understanding Australian political dynamics and cultural nuances, while Catherine began reaching out to local charitable organizations and schools. They both worked hard to maintain their usual public composure while privately struggling with homesickness and the challenge of establishing new routines. George's adjustment proved more difficult than anyone had anticipated. The confident boy who had handled the departure from England with such maturity began showing signs of stress as the reality of permanent change set in. His new school was excellent, but the social dynamics were completely different, and he struggled to connect with classmates who seemed impossibly confident and casual compared to his more formal British upbringing. Catherine spent many evenings sitting on his bed, listening to his concerns and offering reassurance while privately worrying about her eldest son's emotional well-being. Charlotte adapted more easily, finding joy in the differences rather than being overwhelmed by them. Her new ballet class introduced her to different styles and techniques, and she delighted in teaching her Australian classmates proper curtsy form. She made friends quickly, charmed by their open, friendly approach to newcomers. Her positive attitude became a source of strength for the entire family, reminding them that change could bring wonderful opportunities alongside challenges. Louis, being the youngest, seemed to accept the transition with the remarkable flexibility of early childhood. He was fascinated by the different animals he encountered, not just the exotic kangaroos and koalas he had expected, but also the colorful birds that visited their garden and the different insects that seemed so much bigger and more interesting than their British counterparts. His innocent excitement helped lift the family's spirits during moments when the adults felt overwhelmed by the magnitude of their life change. Catherine found herself struggling with unexpected moments of profound homesickness. Simple things would trigger waves of emotion, hearing a familiar song on the radio, seeing a photograph from a friend back home, or noticing how different the stars looked in the southern hemisphere sky. She missed her mother's impromptu visits, the comfortable familiarity of her favorite shops, and the easy relationships she had built with other parents at her children's former schools. The couple's first official engagements in Australia went smoothly from a public perspective, but privately they felt like actors playing familiar roles on a completely unfamiliar stage. The protocol was similar but different. The cultural expectations subtly shifted, and they found themselves constantly translating between their British instincts and Australian social norms. They supported each other through these early challenges, debriefing each evening about what had gone well and what they needed to adjust for future engagements. 3 months into their Australian residency, Catherine experienced what she later described as her breakthrough moment. She was visiting a children's hospital in Melbourne, engaging with young patients and their families in the work that had always brought her the greatest satisfaction. As she sat with a little girl who was recovering from surgery, listening to her chatter about school and friends and dreams, Catherine suddenly realized that service and compassion translated across all cultures and continents. The specific details might be different, but the fundamental human connections that made her work meaningful were universal. That evening, she shared this revelation with William as they sat on their terrace overlooking Sydney Harbour. The view was spectacular in a way that was completely different from anything they had known in England, but no less beautiful. They talked about how their children were beginning to develop Australian accents, how George had finally made a close friend through cricket, and how Charlotte had been invited to perform in a local dance recital. These small victories felt like enormous progress toward making Australia truly feel like home. William admitted that he had been struggling more than he had let on, missing not just the familiar aspects of their old life, but also the deep historical connections he felt to British soil and institutions. However, he was beginning to appreciate how this assignment was deepening his understanding of the Commonwealth and his future role as king. He was learning about different perspectives on monarchy, governance, and international relationships that would serve him well throughout his life. As they prepared for bed that night, Catherine looked out at the unfamiliar constellations in the southern sky and felt something shift inside her. This wasn't home yet, and might never feel exactly like home in the way England did, but it was becoming something else, a place where their family was growing and learning, where they were serving important purposes, and where they were discovering new aspects of themselves and their capabilities. The farewell to England had been necessary to make room for this new chapter, and she was finally beginning to see its value alongside its challenges. 2 years after their arrival in Australia, The Wales family had created a life that none of them could have fully imagined during those tearful farewell moments at Kensington Palace. Catherine stood in their Sydney garden on a warm evening, watching her children play with neighborhood friends who had become like family. The sight filled her with a complex mixture of pride, contentment, and lingering traces of homesickness that she had learned to accept as a permanent part of her emotional landscape. George had not only adapted to Australian life but had begun to thrive in ways that surprised everyone. His natural leadership abilities flourished in the more egalitarian Australian school environment, and he had developed a passion for marine biology inspired by the incredible diversity of sea life around Sydney. He still carried himself with the dignity befitting his future role, but there was a new confidence and ease about him that came from successfully navigating a completely different culture. His cricket skills had improved dramatically, and he proudly wore his school team captain badge. Charlotte had become something of a cultural ambassador, seamlessly blending her British heritage with Australian openness. She performed in local dance productions, taught British etiquette to curious classmates, and had developed a distinctive accent that charmed everyone she met. Her natural grace and kindness had made her popular among her peers, and she had learned to surf with the fearless enthusiasm that characterized her approach to all new experiences. Catherine often marveled at her daughter's ability to maintain her essential self while embracing change. Louis, now speaking with a pronounced Australian accent that delighted and slightly concerned his parents, had grown into a confident little boy who considered himself equally at home in both countries. He could identify dozens of Australian animals and birds, had learned to swim in ocean waves, and possessed an impressive collection of shells and interesting rocks gathered from beaches around Sydney. His innocent adaptability had become a source of strength for the entire family, reminding them that home could be wherever love and family existed. William had found unexpected fulfillment in his Australian role, discovering aspects of leadership and diplomacy that might never have emerged in the more traditional confines of British royal duties. He had helped negotiate important trade agreements, supported disaster relief efforts during bushfire seasons, and developed genuine friendships with Australian political and business leaders. His understanding of the Commonwealth had deepened in ways that would serve him well as future king, and he had gained confidence in his ability to represent British interests while respecting other nations' sovereignty and culture. The family's work in Australia had made tangible differences in various communities and causes. Catherine's advocacy for mental health awareness had helped establish new support programs for young mothers dealing with postpartum depression. William's environmental initiatives had contributed to innovative conservation projects, protecting unique Australian ecosystems. Together, they had raised significant funds for educational programs serving disadvantaged children across the continent. Their success in Australia had not gone unnoticed back home. Regular video calls with King Charles revealed his pride in how they had handled this challenging assignment while maintaining their family unity and individual well-being. The children's grandparents marveled at how much they had grown and matured, though they sometimes worried about the Australian accents and cultural references that increasingly peppered their conversations. As their 3-year assignment neared its conclusion, the family faced the complex emotions of another major transition. The children had formed deep friendships they were reluctant to leave behind. George was torn between excitement about returning to England and sadness about leaving his cricket team and close friends. Charlotte had been selected for an advanced ballet program that she would have to abandon. Louis, now old enough to understand the significance of moving, expressed confusion about why they couldn't simply live in both places. Catherine found herself in the unexpected position of feeling genuinely sad about leaving Australia. The country that had initially felt so foreign had become a place where she had experienced significant personal growth and professional satisfaction. She had developed lasting friendships with women who had supported her through the challenges of royal life in a foreign country. The relaxed Australian lifestyle had allowed their family to experience a more normal daily existence than would ever be possible in Britain. William struggled with similar conflicted emotions. His work in Australia had been deeply satisfying, allowing him to make concrete contributions to policy and international relations in ways that his more ceremonial British role sometimes didn't permit. He had learned to appreciate different approaches to governance and social organization that challenged his assumptions about leadership and service. Leaving felt like abandoning important work that was making real differences in people's lives. The family's final weeks in Australia were filled with farewell parties, special excursions to favorite locations, and countless promises to maintain friendships across the distance. Catherine organized a farewell tea party for Charlotte's friends, teaching them proper British etiquette while learning more about Australian traditions she had come to love. William took George and his cricket team to a professional match, creating memories that would last far beyond their departure. On their final evening in Sydney, the family gathered on their terrace overlooking the harbour, sharing memories of their Australian adventure and talking about their hopes for their return to England. The sunset painted the sky in brilliant colors that they had learned were unique to the Australian landscape, and Catherine realized that part of her heart would always remain in this beautiful country that had challenged her family to grow in unexpected ways. As they prepared for bed in their familiar Australian home for the last time, Catherine tucked each child in with the same mixture of excitement and trepidation she had felt during their departure from England 3 years earlier. But this time the emotions were different. They weren't leaving as sad exiles. They were returning as people who had successfully served their country while discovering new aspects of themselves and their capabilities. The farewell to Australia was bittersweet, but it was also a celebration of growth, service, and the enduring strength of family love that could flourish anywhere in the world.